The transport ship broke through the cloud wall with a shriek that made every cadet grab their seat straps. The storm planet, Teralis 4, stretched beneath them like a boiling ocean of mercury, its waves flashing silver with each bolt of lightning. The mission briefing had described the surface as challenging, yet survivable, but no one had mentioned that it would look like the throat of an angry god. When the ship's belly opened and the drop pods launched into the gale, the group of mixed-species cadets screamed in 20 languages. The human, Lieutenant Aaron Reeves, said nothing. His pod shook so hard that the hull screamed, but his eyes remained fixed on the readouts, tracking wind speed, pressure, and rotation patterns. He was calm, but it wasn't courage. It was focus, the kind that comes when fear has no room left inside a man. The pod hit the ocean like a meteor. Saltwater surged through the cracks, and every warning light flashed red. The planet's gravity was slightly weaker than Earth's, but the storms were far worse than anything in his memory. The first thing he did was release the emergency raft and secure his equipment. Around him, the comms channels filled with shouts and static. Alien cadets called for help, reporting broken rafts, flooded cockpits, and missing crewmates. The instructors had told them this was a test of endurance. Survive one full planetary cycle, 1 year, using only what the drop provided. No reinforcements, no resupply, no interference. If you failed, you became another lost beacon for the next group to find. The human adjusted his breathing regulator and climbed onto the raft, gripping the edge with his gloved hands as a wall of water rolled toward him. The wind howled, ripping his voice from his throat, so he stopped shouting entirely. The first night was endless. The stars were hidden behind clouds, and the waves beat the raft like fists. The air smelled like metal, sharp and alive with static. Aaron tied himself to the raft with the emergency cord and waited for dawn. When light finally came, it was no softer than night. The entire sky burned a sickly green as lightning laced through black clouds. He could see fragments of other pods drifting far away, bright like floating embers before they vanished under the waves. One belonged to a Zarthian cadet named Kel, a reptilian species known for endurance. The others were scattered too far to reach. Aaron marked their coordinates, then watched as one by one the signals vanished from his scanner. Within 3 days, half the cadets were presumed dead. The storms did not ease. They came in waves of increasing intensity, like the planet itself was testing the will of those who dared touch it. The human realized early that the storm was not random. It moved in cycles, spiraling around magnetic poles deep under the ocean. He had studied weather engineering back on Earth, where humanity learned to seed clouds, redirect hurricanes, and steal moisture from the desert winds. Compared to that, this was chaos, but chaos still had patterns. Using the fragments of his pod, he built a crude compass. Metal shards suspended in liquid within a sealed mask visor, it was enough to track drift and keep his raft aligned with the currents. During the next few days, Aaron scavenged what the storm carried: pieces of hulls, dead machines, torn survival gear. Everything had potential. He tied floating wreckage to his raft until it grew into a patchwork platform big enough to walk on. He built a mast from a broken stabilizer and used his emergency blanket as a sail. The first time it caught wind, the entire structure nearly capsized, but he adjusted the tension, trimming the edges until it glided across the waves with surprising grace. Around him, the horizon stretched endless and merciless. The radio crackled every few hours with faint signals. Some cadets were alive, but their voices were panicked, unstable. He heard one pleading for extraction, another sobbing that her ship had sunk, and one last message filled with only static and screams before cutting out. Aaron listened to them all, marking the coordinates of the signals and repeating a simple phrase: stay above the water, conserve energy, use wreckage to stay afloat. Few answered. Most of the time, the silence returned. He had no illusions about rescue. The instructors had said no contact would be allowed. This was a year-long exile designed to break those who relied on comfort and to reveal those who could create it from nothing. He didn't plan to wait for the storm to end. He planned to live within it. By the end of the first month, the rain had become a kind of companion. The sound of it striking the metal was constant, a reminder that life was still possible because movement meant time was passing. He had managed to catch edible plankton using strips of his uniform tied between poles, forming a small net that glowed faintly in the dark. It wasn't food by any normal definition, but it kept him alive. He boiled it in the lid of a broken engine cylinder, using sparking wires to ignite a small fire under an inverted panel. The heat was weak, but it was warmth, and warmth on this planet was victory. The storms began to change, becoming colder as the planetary orbit moved toward its long winter. Aaron adapted again. He wrapped the emergency sail around his shoulders, layered insulation from melted foam, and began tracking the debris fields. The ocean carried more than pieces of pods now. Massive metallic skeletons drifted by, remains of older ships perhaps from previous trials. Their sharp silhouettes broke through the fog like tombstones of forgotten missions. When one passed close enough, Aaron lashed his raft to its frame and climbed aboard. The structure was huge, maybe the remains of a transport vessel. Inside, it smelled of rust, mold, and history. He scavenged everything: panels, wires, containers, even shattered glass to use as cutting tools. As he dragged the parts back to his raft, a realization formed slowly, like dawn behind a cloud. These wrecks were not obstacles. They were resources. The storm destroyed, but it also delivered. Each current, each wave brought something new within reach. The planet was violent, but it was also generous to those who listened. He began to map its rhythm. He learned that storms rotated counterclockwise every 9 days, that calm zones formed briefly along the equatorial belt, and that lightning followed predictable arcs along magnetic ridges. Knowledge became his greatest weapon, and soon his small raft evolved into a stable platform reinforced by salvaged beams. When the next cyclone struck, he didn't run. He faced the wind, anchored the platform with cables, and let the storm's force tighten his bindings instead of tearing them apart. He shouted into the wind, not in anger, but in defiance. And when the storm finally broke, his raft was still there, larger, stronger, and alive. The Academy's test had intended to measure endurance, but endurance was more than surviving. It was adapting, building, and refusing to yield. As Aaron stared across the endless water, lightning flashing around him like veins of living fire, he realized the truth that every storm had whispered since the moment he landed. The only way to endure was to create. And somewhere deep inside, he already knew that what he was beginning to build would change the course of the entire trial. Aaron's raft had long ceased to be a simple survival craft. After weeks of collecting debris, he had built something that creaked and groaned with a structure of its own, a foundation large enough to walk upon without fear of it folding into the waves. But stability came with silence, and silence on Taralis 4 was never a good sign. The storm patterns had shifted. The rhythm he had once trusted began to break apart, scattering the currents and altering the magnetic balance. He understood immediately what that meant. A superstorm was forming. For 3 days, the wind disappeared entirely, and the ocean turned glass smooth under an eerie white sky. The air felt thick and electric, humming through his bones as if the entire world was holding its breath. The storm's absence was worse than its presence. It was the pause before punishment. Aaron tightened every rope and adjusted the tension of his platform. He had welded a partial frame from bent beams scavenged from the wreck of an old transport, enough to form a skeleton for the shelter he was building. When he looked at the endless horizon, he saw glints of metal far away, more wrecks drifting with the current, scattered like bones of ancient beasts. One night, through the mist, he caught sight of movement, light flickering red against the waves. He raised his hand in reflex, shielding his eyes, then activated the flare beacon he had saved. The response came back seconds later, a flash of violet. Someone else was alive. He set his sail and steered toward the faint light. It took hours of rowing through fog and slow currents before he reached what remained of another survival raft. A collapsed figure lay on it, unmoving, half covered in a metallic blanket. Aaron climbed aboard, his boots scraping the warped metal. The alien was breathing, but barely. Her skin was pale green and scaled, her face sharp and unfamiliar. Zarthian. She had likely been part of one of the other cadet teams. Her name tag still clung to the torn edge of her uniform. Kel. He checked her pulse, then wrapped her in his spare insulation sheet and gave her a rationed share of melted plankton water. She stirred weakly, whispering in broken galactic standard. "You survived?" He gave a short nod. "Long enough to find you." When dawn returned, the air shifted again. The horizon darkened, clouds spiraling in a pattern that only one with experience could recognize. The superstorm was coming, Faster than expected, the ocean began to move, lifting and falling in slow, terrible rhythm. Erin secured Kel's raft to his and reinforced the junction with metal rods. She watched him work, her eyes hollow but alert, following each movement as if memorizing it. He worked in silence, hammering with fragments of carbon pipe until the joint held firm. When the wind arrived, it came all at once. The surface exploded into a frenzy of motion, raindrops like stones striking metal, lightning bursting across the horizon in sheets of fire. Keels screamed as the raft tilted, but Erin's hands moved with practiced calm. He had already built anchor weights from solid engine cores tied to long cables. He dropped them now, and the platform steadied. For the next 6 hours, the storm tore across them like a living creature, roaring in frustration that its prey refused to die. When morning broke, the storm was gone. The waves were calmer, but the ocean was littered with new gifts, wreckage and debris from shattered pods. Erin stood at the edge of the platform watching fragments drift by. He saw torn ship plating, supply boxes, and the twisted frames of engines. He motioned for Kel to stay on the main raft while he tied a rope around his waist and dove into the cold water. The ocean swallowed him whole, its silence oppressive after the chaos above. He kicked downward, gripping at whatever floated within reach, dragging usable pieces back to the surface. Each dive brought something new. Sheets of titanium, fragments of alloy, and, most valuable of all, sections of hull thick enough to build walls. Kel helped him lift the heavier pieces using improvised hooks. The two of them worked without words, understanding each other through rhythm and exhaustion alone. By the end of that day, the raft had doubled in size. Erin began connecting the fragments into a circular pattern, forming a stable perimeter that could absorb the force of the waves. Kel watched as he welded one joint after another with sparking wires and a battery cell. When he finally rested, she asked, "You plan to live here?" He looked up, sweat mixing with the salt rain on his face. "No," he said quietly. "I plan to build something that can live without me." She didn't ask what he meant. During the next week, Erin and Kel began expanding their operation. The planet's ocean was vast, but the currents carried consistent debris from the southern hemisphere, wrecks of cadets who had failed. He didn't speak of them, but he used every part of what the sea offered. Kel had recovered her coordination and began diving alongside him. Her reptilian physiology allowed her to withstand longer submersions, so she became essential in retrieving heavier sections of wreckage. They found pieces of starship hulls large enough to walk across, parts of solar wings, and even the skeletal remains of a cargo shuttle. Each time they returned to the platform, Erin connected the new materials, reshaping his floating fortress into something that resembled a half-submerged city. The storms came and went in repeating cycles, but each one felt shorter, less powerful, not because the planet had changed, but because the human had learned how to anticipate it. He had built a series of flexible joints that allowed the raft to twist with the current instead of breaking under pressure. The ocean tried to destroy him, and he answered with design. Kel began to follow his lead with quiet reverence. She watched how he studied the waves, measuring their intervals, adjusting the shape of the raft, and redirecting weight across the structure. Once, when she asked why he worked so tirelessly, he answered without looking at her, his tone even. "If the storm decides to take me, it will have to work harder than this." The floating base had grown large enough that he could walk across it and hear the difference in sound between sections, some hollow, some solid, some reinforced. He learned to recognize weak points by listening. He built new connections, shaping the structure into a broad circle that deflected the strongest waves. The center became a calm pool, a natural harbor. The idea came to him while he was watching a broken freighter drift by. The human brain, he thought, wasn't made for mere endurance. It was made for creation. If he was destined to spend a year trapped in this violent world, he would shape it into something that belonged to him. On the 12th week, another storm rolled across the horizon. This one was colder and thicker, its clouds a deep violet. The waves rose higher than ever before. The structure shuddered but didn't break. When lightning struck close, it illuminated the growing circle of metal platforms, each piece reflecting light like scales on a great sea creature. Kel stood beside him, her eyes wide. "It's alive," she said softly. Erin didn't respond. He simply nodded and tightened a rope around the mast, steadying it. After the storm, the two of them found another drifting beacon, a faint blue light, half submerged. They approached carefully and discovered two more survivors clinging to a broken escape pod, both alien cadets from different species. One was a thin insectoid researcher named Vran, whose wings were torn and useless. The other was a broad-shouldered amphibian cadet named Reth, barely conscious. Aaron pulled them aboard, wrapped them in spare coverings, and said only, "You're safe now. Help comes later. Work first." He didn't command them with rank or threat, but his voice carried a certainty that left no room for argument. As the new arrivals regained strength, they followed his lead without question. He assigned each of them a task. Kel would dive for materials, Vran would maintain the mechanical wiring and signals, and Reth would reinforce the outer structure. He taught them how to tie knots, how to balance metal plates for tension, and how to read the motion of the waves. Slowly, the group began to function like a single organism. The floating structure expanded in every direction, growing into a formation stable enough for multiple shelters. The storm planet, once an enemy, now became a source of life. At night, the four survivors gathered around the faint glow of bioluminescent plankton that Aaron cultivated in glass jars. The light flickered against their faces, pale and fragile. Kel often stared into the dark horizon where other beacons once blinked. "How many are left?" she asked one night. Aaron looked at the radar, its screen faintly green. "Enough," he said quietly, though he knew most had gone silent. He would not let despair take them, not after everything they had built. By the end of that cycle, the raft was no longer a raft. It had become something greater, a foundation strong enough to resist the storm's cruelty. From a single human raft and one dying alien, a harbor had begun to rise out of the endless, unforgiving sea. The ocean still roared, the lightning still split the sky, but now it reflected off metal towers and cables that shimmered with defiance. The trial was no longer about endurance. It was about transformation. And Aaron, standing on the edge of his creation, understood that he had already changed the meaning of the test. The harbor floated like a living creature beneath the bruised sky, its metallic bones rising and falling with the rhythm of the ocean. 3 months had passed since the last great storm, and the structure had evolved beyond recognition. The circular foundation now spanned hundreds of meters, with interconnected decks forged from the remains of old ships and reinforced by cables woven from polymer fiber. In the center, the calm pool shimmered faintly blue under the dim light of captured plankton lamps. It was no longer just a survival platform, it was a home. Aaron stood at the edge of the upper deck, watching as the waves lapped gently against the hulls below. The air was cold and heavy, but for the first time since landing, there was no immediate danger. Around him, the small group of survivors worked with steady discipline. Reth was repairing a cracked beam, his amphibian skin glistening from the mist. Vran was hunched over a cluster of salvaged processors, coaxing life back into damaged circuitry. Kel, tireless as ever, was assembling new buoyant supports along the outer ring, her movements sharp and methodical. Each of them had found a purpose under Aaron's quiet direction. He didn't bark orders. He simply worked harder than anyone, and the others followed because he made them believe in something greater than endurance. Over the past weeks, he had introduced order to chaos. Rations were counted, shifts were scheduled, and every storm became a test of what they had learned rather than a threat. What once had been an accident of survival was turning into a functioning society. Yet progress brought new problems. Food remained scarce, and the limited plankton reserves could not sustain them indefinitely. The group had grown to 9 after rescuing others from drifting pods, and the original supplies were long gone. Aaron knew that sooner or later, the ocean would have to provide more than just metal. He spent hours studying the ecosystem, observing how bioluminescent life gathered under light, and how the storm winds influenced the migration of surface feeders. He designed traps from twisted mesh and electromagnetic coils, creating a kind of underwater net that drew smaller organisms upward. The first catch was a miracle, a translucent mass of jelly-like creatures rich in protein and salt. He boiled them in recycled coolant fluid, producing the first real meal the group had eaten in months. No one spoke during that dinner. The silence was sacred, but beyond the boundaries of their floating world, the storm planet remained merciless. A new front of clouds had begun forming along the western horizon, taller and darker than anything before. Aaron stood on the observation deck one evening, studying the cloud structure through a cracked visor. He didn't fear it, but he understood what it meant. The next storm would not be a passing test. It would be the planet's attempt to erase what he had built. He spent the next several days reinforcing the harbor. He ordered Reth to strengthen the anchor cables and Vran to stabilize the internal energy system. Kel led the team collecting floating debris to build external barriers. Every bolt, every panel, every connection mattered. The harbor groaned under the strain of construction, but it held together. The sound became a language of its own, a conversation between man and machine. On the fifth morning, the wind began to scream. The horizon disappeared into a solid wall of rain. Lightning flashed in arcs so long they cut across the sky like fractures in glass. Aaron moved through the storm without hesitation, shouting instructions as the wind threatened to rip his voice away. The group worked in unison, hauling ropes, locking panels, reinforcing seals. The storm struck at full force, smashing into the outer hulls and splitting several in half. Metal screamed, water exploded upward, and darkness swallowed everything. Reth was thrown against a railing, nearly swept into the sea, but Aaron caught him by the arm and pulled him back. He could feel the raw power of the wind tearing through his clothes, freezing his skin, but he didn't stop. Every instinct screamed to hide, yet he kept climbing, tying knots, sealing gaps, and shouting commands until his voice broke. Hours turned into an eternity of chaos. When dawn returned, the harbor was barely recognizable. Half the outer platforms were gone, swallowed by the sea, but the core structure remained, floating stubbornly amid debris and foam. Exhausted, Aaron collapsed onto the deck, his body trembling from cold and exertion. The others gathered around him in silence. Kel's eyes were red, not from tears, but from windburn. Vran's hands twitched from exhaustion. Reth leaned against a shattered pillar, staring at the sky. The storm had taken everything it could, but once again it had failed to finish what it started. The human opened his eyes slowly and let out a faint laugh. It was hoarse and broken, but it spread among the survivors like warmth. Against all logic, they had survived again. The weeks that followed became the turning point. The harbor, though damaged, grew stronger in reconstruction. The survivors learned from every mistake, turning failure into design. Under Aaron's guidance, the harbor's shape changed. Instead of wide, flat decks, he built interlocking triangular sections that flexed with the waves, distributing pressure evenly. The internal systems evolved as well. Vran repaired a small fusion cell salvaged from the wreckage of a drone, providing limited but stable power. Reth constructed new stabilizers using magnetic plates that interacted with the planet's electric fields. Kel designed fishing rigs using bioluminescent lures that attracted edible sea life during the night. Every improvement brought the harbor closer to something that felt almost civilized. The storms no longer terrified them. They anticipated them, studied them, even used them. One evening, as the wind settled into a rare calm, Aaron stood by the edge of the deck, watching the horizon glow faintly red. The sea was calmer than usual, reflecting the clouds like a mirror. Kel joined him, her posture relaxed, but her eyes wary. "Do you ever think about leaving?" she asked softly. He didn't turn to look at her. "No, not until this place can live on its own." She tilted her head slightly. "You mean, without us?" He nodded slowly. "If it can survive 1 year here, it deserves to keep existing, even after we're gone." His voice was low but certain, the kind of tone that carried conviction without needing explanation. Later that night, he recorded a message on one of the salvage transmitters. It wasn't a distress signal, but a log, a record of their progress. He described the harbor's design, the ecosystem that supported it, and the principles that allowed it to adapt to the storms. His voice, calm and clear, carried through the static. "We came here to endure, but endurance without creation is just waiting to die. If anyone finds this, know that the storm can be conquered, not by resistance, but by understanding." When he finished, he sealed the recording and attached it to a buoy. The current would decide its fate. As the months passed, the harbor began attracting attention. New survivors drawn by faint signals or light reflections found their way to its perimeter. Some arrived weak and delirious. Others came on makeshift rafts barely holding together. Aaron accepted them all. Each newcomer brought fragments of their past, pieces of knowledge that enriched the growing community. One was a former engineer who taught the group how to use heat differentials between the air and water to generate power. Another, a biologist, discovered that the ocean's plankton could be cultivated using sound vibrations. The harbor became more than a refuge. It became a laboratory of survival, a testament to what Unity could accomplish under the worst conditions imaginable. Soon the structure expanded into multiple tiers, with lower decks dedicated to water filtration and food storage, and upper levels reserved for living quarters and observation towers. At night, the glow from hundreds of lanterns illuminated the sea like a constellation. The alien cadets, once strangers divided by language and species, began to call the humans' creation by a single name, Haven. The word spread through whispered gratitude and quiet awe. Aaron rarely slept. He spent his nights walking the decks, inspecting the connections, adjusting ropes, and checking pressure levels. He had grown thinner, his face harder, but his eyes were alive with relentless purpose. Sometimes he stood on the highest point of the structure, staring into the endless dark. The storm planet still roared beyond the horizon, restless and unforgiving, but his creation stood unbroken. In those moments, he felt something close to peace. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was shaping the will of the storm into something that breathed, something that belonged to both man and machine. The test was still far from over, but the tide had shifted. The ocean no longer dictated his fate. He did. The harbor had entered its 4th season on Taralis 4, and the air felt different now. The wind that once screamed endlessly across the sea had softened into a steady rhythm, almost respectful. The storms still came, but the floating city no longer trembled at their approach. What had begun as a raft had become a network of platforms and towers, a living machine balanced between chaos and control. The survivors called it Haven, and for the first time, the word felt true. The ocean, once a merciless enemy, had become their partner. Every sound, every wave, every flicker of lightning carried meaning. The community had grown to over 20 cadets of different species, each one bound by shared endurance and the quiet authority of the human who had made all this possible. Aaron Reeves was no longer seen as one of them. He had become something else, a figure that existed between myth and command. No one questioned his decisions, and no one dared to imagine what would happen if he was gone. He stood on the upper observation tower, staring into the horizon where storm clouds gathered like sleeping beasts. His face had changed, leaner, sharper, marked by sun and salt, but his eyes still held that unbreakable focus that had carried them through every test. Below, the harbor moved like an organism breathing in rhythm with the waves. The windmills spun slowly, feeding power into the systems Vran had repaired months ago. The algae farms glowed softly beneath the decks, pulsing with life as Kel oversaw the new harvest. The floating city had become sustainable, but Aaron was restless. Stability, he knew, was a trap. The Academy's test was still ongoing, and survival alone was not the goal. To endure was one thing, but to thrive, to teach endurance, was another. He had started teaching long before the others realized what he was doing. Every task he assigned carried a lesson: how to read the waves, how to judge the air by taste, how to build with motion instead of against it. He gathered the younger cadets each morning and made them observe before acting. The storm is not your enemy, he told them. It's your teacher. If you listen to it long enough, you'll hear what it's trying to tell you. The aliens struggled to understand his way at first. Many had come from worlds where technology handled everything, where instinct had no place. But the humans' logic was simple and precise. He taught them to rely on senses rather than instruments, to read patterns hidden in the planet's chaos. Slowly, they began to change. One of the cadets, a slender avian named Syrah, became his most dedicated student. She spent every spare hour shadowing him, recording his measurements and mimicking his methods. Her wings were too fragile for the constant wind, so she walked with a limp, but her mind was sharp. Aaron saw in her something familiar, a hunger to understand, not just to follow. Under his guidance, she learned how to predict current shifts by watching plankton movement and how to reinforce cables using knots that flexed under pressure instead of snapping. The others began to look to her as they once had to him. He noticed the change but said nothing. The harbor needed more than one leader to survive what was coming. As the days grew longer, a strange stillness settled across the ocean. The storms retreated farther north, leaving the equatorial belt unusually calm. The air temperature rose, and the water began to evaporate faster than usual. Aaron noticed salt crusts forming along the deck edges and an increase in static discharges between the platforms. He ran diagnostics on the sensors Vran had restored, and the readings confirmed his fear. The planet's magnetic field was fluctuating. The equilibrium that had allowed their small world to exist was about to break. A global electrical storm was forming, one strong enough to annihilate everything above water. He gathered the team that night under the central tower, his expression grim but composed. "This is not another storm," he said. "This is the planet's reset. If we stay on the surface, we die." The silence that followed was heavy. Kel crossed her arms, her scaled skin shimmering under the dim light. "Then where do we go?" "There is no land. There is only water." Aaron glanced toward the horizon. "Then we go below it." He began outlining his plan. Over the past months, they had collected enough sealed pods, pressure containers, and hull sections to construct submersible chambers. The fusion cell could power short dives, but it was never designed for long-term underwater habitation. Still, it was the only chance they had. They would anchor the harbor to the seafloor, sealing the core section while the upper decks were sacrificed to the storm. He divided tasks with mechanical precision. Kel and Reth would reinforce the lower structures, Vran would regulate oxygen flow, and Sierra would oversee sealing procedures. There was no room for failure. The following days became a race against time. The sky turned darker with each passing hour, the air charged with static so intense that sparks leapt between the rails. The cadets worked without rest, welding, bolting, and sealing as lightning danced across the distant clouds. Aaron barely slept. He moved from one section to another, tightening cables, checking pressure valves, and calibrating the ballast systems. Every sound of metal was a countdown. The global storm arrived sooner than predicted. It began with a silence so deep that even the waves stopped moving. The ocean seemed to inhale, and then, all at once, it exhaled with violence. Lightning tore across the entire sky in a continuous sheet of blinding light. The horizon vanished. The world became white fire and roaring thunder. Aaron gave the signal. The outer decks detached, drifting upward as bait for the storm's fury. The core structure, Haven's heart, began to descend, guided by massive cables and counterweights. The ocean swallowed them whole, and for a moment, the light above was replaced by the darkness of the deep. The descent was rough. Pressure alarms screamed, bolts creaked, and water seeped through fractured seals. Aaron moved through the central chamber, steadying cadets and reinforcing joints with improvised clamps. Sierra monitored the descent through a cracked display, her feathers trembling with fear. "Pressure stable at 70%, she called out. "Depth 10 meters. The human nodded, gripping the railing. The lights flickered, then steadied. Above them, the storm raged unseen. Hours passed before the sensors detected calm. The storm above was still destroying everything on the surface, but below, the ocean remained silent. The light from bioluminescent plankton filtered through the water, painting the metal walls in faint green glow. The group waited in tense silence, counting minutes. The fusion core held steady, feeding minimal power to air filters and heating units. Eventually, the rumble faded. Aaron exhaled slowly. "We hold until dawn," he said, his voice low but steady. "If the structure survives the pressure shift, we rise." When morning came, the water above shimmered faintly. The storm had burned itself out, leaving a sky bruised but calm. Aaron gave the order to ascend. The ballast systems hissed, releasing stored pressure. The harbor rose slowly, shedding water like a creature awakening from hibernation. When it finally broke the surface, the survivors gasped. The once expansive city was gone, reduced to fragments drifting across the horizon. Only the core platform remained, scarred but intact. The storm had erased almost everything, but what was left was stronger than before. In the following days, they began rebuilding once more. The loss was immense, but Aaron didn't allow grief to take hold. Instead, he turned it into momentum. He gathered the remaining cadets and spoke plainly. "Now you know what survival really means," he said. "You build, you lose, and you build again. That's how life works on every world worth living on." His words struck something deep in each of them. The work resumed, faster than before, more purposeful. Even the newest survivors who had barely known him followed his example with quiet devotion. Weeks later, when the ocean finally calmed, Haven had taken a new form. It was smaller, leaner, and more resilient. The floating city no longer fought the storms. It danced with them. The design had evolved into a structure that curved with the waves instead of resisting their force. Under the pale light of the twin moons, the harbor glimmered like a jewel reborn from the ashes of its own destruction. Aaron stood at the highest point, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The trial was nearing its end, but he didn't care about recognition or records anymore. He cared only that this place lived, that the lesson of endurance would remain long after the last human footstep left its decks. When the final storm passed and the sea returned to silence, the sky above Taralis 4 cleared for the first time in a year. The clouds thinned into long silver ribbons, and sunlight, real sunlight, poured through, scattering across the ocean in gold and blue. The light struck the rebuilt harbor and reflected off its curved decks, illuminating the metallic arcs that rose from the surface like the ribs of a colossal sea creature. Haven was no longer a desperate construction of wreckage and wire. It had become an engineered miracle. Its floating sections curved with the waves in graceful harmony. Its towers glowed with recycled bioluminescent energy, and the entire structure pulsed softly with life. The human who had created it stood at the highest point of the central mast, his hands resting on the rail as the wind played through his hair. Aaron Reeves had not slept for 2 days, yet his eyes were bright. The planet that once sought to destroy him now looked almost peaceful. The survivors had changed as well. Each of them bore marks of the storm, scars, burns, broken bones, but their faces had hardened into something new, something born of struggle and purpose. Kell supervised the outer platforms, directing teams of divers who retrieved floating debris for reconstruction. Vran, once a timid engineer, had become confident and outspoken, designing new filtration systems that made the water drinkable without heat. Sira, now stronger and steadier, handled the observation duties that Aaron once kept for himself. He had trained her to read the horizon, to predict the movement of the waves, to understand how the planet breathed. She carried out her work with quiet pride. What once had been fear had become wisdom. The Academy's retrieval window was drawing near. Every cadet knew that soon the fleet would arrive to evaluate the survivors and collect the results of the trial. But no one spoke of leaving. For many of them, the harbor had become something sacred, proof that cooperation, intelligence, and will could turn disaster into creation. Aaron walked among them, inspecting cables, tightening bolts, adjusting the sails that now doubled as solar collectors. He offered no speeches, no grand words of leadership. His silence was its own kind of command. The others followed because he had earned that loyalty through every cut, every scar, every decision that kept them alive. On the 25th day after the storm, a flash of light appeared on the horizon. The scanners registered incoming signals, clean, rhythmic pulses matching the Academy's communication codes. The rescue fleet had entered the atmosphere. The announcement rippled through the harbor like electricity. The cadets gathered at the central platform, staring at the sky, where white streaks of descending ships cut through the blue haze. Kell's voice trembled as she spoke. "It's over. We made it." Aaron said nothing at first. He watched the descending vessels with a mixture of relief and hesitation. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The exhaustion that he had ignored pressed down on him, heavier than any storm. When the first shuttle descended, its thrusters whipped the water into spirals. The deck shook under the force, but the harbor held steady. The ramp lowered, and figures in silver uniforms stepped onto the platform. The lead officer, a tall woman with the insignia of the Galactic Academy, scanned the structure around her with disbelief. "Where are your shelters?" she asked, her voice echoing through the open air. Vran laughed quietly. "You're standing on one," he said. She turned toward Aaron, her expression hard to read. "Lieutenant Reeves, this is your doing." He nodded. "Ours," he corrected calmly. "We built it together." The inspection took hours. The officers walked through every section, scanning materials, recording data, questioning survivors. What they saw defied their expectations. The test had been designed to measure endurance, to see who could survive isolation, storms, and scarcity. No one had imagined that the human would build a functioning colony. When the chief evaluator finally returned to the central platform, she looked at Aaron with something close to respect. "You understand that this changes everything," she said. "The trial was never meant to create civilization." He met her gaze, steady and unflinching. Maybe it should have been. By evening, the sky burned orange, and the rescue fleet hovered above the sea, preparing for departure. The cadets began gathering their personal effects, packing what little they still possessed. The atmosphere was heavy with silence. None of them seemed eager to leave. Kel approached Aaron as he tightened one last cable on the railing. "You'll come with us, won't you?" she asked quietly. He looked past her toward the horizon where the sun was melting into the ocean. "I will," he said after a pause, "but part of me will stay here. Everything I built, everything we built, belongs to this place now." When the last light faded, the boarding began. One by one, the survivors ascended the ramps, their boots echoing on metal. Aaron was the last to leave. Before stepping onto the shuttle, he turned and looked at Haven one final time. The harbor glowed under the twin moons, its structures shimmering like veins of silver against the dark sea. It moved gently, breathing with the rhythm of the waves. It no longer looked like something made by hands. It looked alive. He stood there in silence for a long moment before saluting the horizon. "Hold together," he whispered. Then he stepped aboard the shuttle, and the hatch sealed behind him. The ascent was quiet. Through the window, the harbor grew smaller, a glimmering ring floating on an endless ocean. Around it, fragments of wreckage drifted like shadows, reminders of everything that had been lost. The ship broke through the atmosphere, and the ocean vanished beneath clouds. Inside the cabin, the cadets sat in silence, lost in thought. No one spoke of victory or glory. There was only the quiet understanding that what they had experienced would follow them forever. Weeks later, at the Academy's debriefing hall, the survivors stood before a panel of officials. The evaluators questioned every detail: the methods, the leadership, the construction, the use of materials. When it was Aaron's turn to speak, he stepped forward and placed a small data drive on the table. "This contains the blueprints of Haven," he said simply. "Its energy system, structural dynamics, and ecosystem design. It's proof that survival is not endurance, it's adaptation. We didn't pass your test. We changed it." The panel remained silent for a long moment before the lead evaluator finally spoke. "You've turned a trial into a lesson, Lieutenant Reeves. Perhaps that was the real test all along." Months passed. The story of Haven spread throughout the Galactic Academy, whispered in training halls and mess decks. Cadets spoke of the human who built a city from wreckage and taught others how to thrive where no one should have survived. His name became a legend, not because of heroism, but because he proved that endurance was creation in disguise. Years later, long after the Academy had moved on to new trials, a deep space probe orbiting Taralis 4 transmitted a signal back to the core worlds. The ocean below shimmered as if alive. The camera zoomed in, and there it was, Haven. Still afloat, still moving. The windmills turned slowly, and the lights flickered in the darkness. No one knew who maintained it or how it continued to function, but it remained there, unbroken, alive under the endless storms. In his later years, Aaron returned to Earth and lived quietly by the sea. Sometimes, when the wind howled across the cliffs, he would close his eyes and hear the old storm again. He could almost feel the sway of the deck under his feet, the cold air on his face, the hum of the ocean breathing beneath the metal. The memory of Haven never left him. He had built it not just to survive, but to prove a truth that the universe too often forgot, that creation was the highest form of endurance. And so, when his last day came, he died as he had lived, with the sound of waves in his ears and the faint echo of a storm whispering across a distant ocean where his harbor still waited, eternal under the endless sky.